What is the purpose of metaphor in personal development? We often hear about metaphor taught in literature, but today I want to talk to you about why metaphor can be so important to supporting us on our personal development path. So let's dive in. You might be wondering, what is the purpose of metaphor when you're watching a women's empowerment channel? Well, today I want to show you why metaphor can be so important to helping us to understand more of ourselves, which of course is a big part of how we move forward on this path to empowerment. So today I'm going to show you what is the purpose of metaphor, particularly in personal development, where we can find metaphor to work with, and how we can use metaphor in our lives to continue to grow and expand and become more empowered. So what is the purpose of metaphor? Now, metaphor is a tool used in literature and storytelling to compare two things, to really kind of almost make one thing another by symbolically representing it, right? And so we get to be able to see something from a new perspective. These things being compared may seem unrelated, but metaphorically speaking, we can see that they actually have a connection. Don't worry, we're going to get into the piece where, okay, give me an example. What is an example of a metaphor? We're going to get into that when I talk about where can we find metaphor. Metaphor in personal development specifically is an opportunity for us to see ourselves in different ways, almost through the eyes of different things. I often talk about in my coaching and teaching work that everything, it's kind of that phrase, as above, so below. We could look at that and say, you know, as macrocosmically, microcosmically, and vice versa, right? So we see this incredible reflecting of life itself within us. And we genuinely, this is one of the most amazing things that I find about human beings, and also looking at life metaphorically, archetypally. These kinds of things are so powerful because human beings have all of it within us. We have the plants, the animals, the minerals, the sky, right? The earth. We have all of these kinds of things. So a metaphor can be a symbol, like, you know, maybe it's the tree or the sky or a cloud, and we hear this all the time, right? Like, oh, she was stuck in a cloud of despair, right? Well, she wasn't literally stuck in a cloud of despair, but we sure know what that means when someone says we're stuck in a cloud of despair, right? The comparison, the power of that, the power of recognizing that can be so amazing. And that's one way that it might be used in storytelling. But for personal development, what we do is we begin to look at, how can I see myself in these other things, right? Where does that cloud of despair live in me, or that rain cloud live in me? How does it express in me? How does it show up? We can also see the examples of metaphor in things like stories, like the hero's journey, right? We have this concept of a hero's journey that is guiding us forward, and we relate to the story on some level within the inner journey of our soul life. We can also see metaphor in the concept of an object, like, oh, she was a block of ice, right? She's not literally a block of ice, but there's this aspect of, oh, she must be really, really cold, right? This is the power of metaphor. We have something, there's something in it that creates an image, an experience, a relationship that speaks to the soul. It helps us with our inner development, our personal development work. It helps us with our soul work because we begin to see ways in which we relate to the world around us, and the way the world around us can relate to our inner experience, right? And how it is expressed to us through these stories or physical objects or experiences. So where can metaphor be found? Where can we find this opportunity to relate to metaphor? Well, I've already mentioned the concept of stories, and one of my absolute favorites is wisdom of fairy tales, the wisdom of fairy tales. These stories have so much within them, both metaphorically, if we look at them as a metaphor for our own soul's journey, and also archetypally, if we look at the characters. And I'll talk about archetypes in another video, but basically the difference really is you're looking at comparing or contrasting two things, using a metaphor to represent symbolically something else, where an archetype is kind of like an original blueprint that We all know, we all know what a mother archetype is. We all know what an archetype of a tree is, right? We have a picture of what it's supposed to look like, or what it's supposed to have, or what's part of it, right? But when it's a metaphor, we become that tree. We have roots, right? What are our roots? We don't literally have roots growing into the ground, and yet we do have roots. I use this concept of nature archetypes and metaphors very significantly in my Solace program, which I encourage you to check out the details about, both the Wisdom of Fairy Tales class and the Solace program in the description. There's lots of great information there for you. This idea of looking at stories as archetype, also nature, right? We are the water. We are the trees. We are the birds. How are we that? And you can ask yourself that question, right? You don't have to ask someone else. I invite you to explore it. How does the tree live in me? How does the water live in me, right? How do I express like water? Am I flowing or am I dammed up, right? Look at that right there. I'm not literally flowing out as a puddle on the ground, and I'm not literally dammed up. But when I say things in those terms, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? This is the power of metaphor in personal development. We can also find metaphor in objects, as I was saying, right? What does it mean to say, he was stiff as a lamp? What does that mean, right? Stiff and straight as a lamppost, or something like that, right? There are objects that we can relate things to. There's also history, right? We can take something from history and metaphorically compare it to something going on today. And that can come in many different examples, right? Even if we want to look at slavery as an example of a symbol of something, we can talk now today and say he was enslaved to his work. Okay, not the same, I get it, as the oppressive experience of slavery, but we know what slavery means. And so when we hear something around being enslaved to our work, we're really not free from our experiences. We're not finding ourselves in our experiences. And it's a very powerful tool to hear, far more than, oh, you work too much, right? If we had a partner that came to us and said, you are enslaved to your work versus you work too much, which one's going to sound more powerful, right? Which one's going to hit us harder? Which one's going to resonate more? That's the power of metaphor. We can find it in so many places. And I love also looking at sacred texts, every sacred text. Before I knew metaphor and archetype, it was hard for me to consider sacred texts like the Bible. I have a Christian background. I've expanded that significantly to include lots of different wisdom traditions in my own spiritual practice. But the Bible was difficult for me because so often I found the preachers wanting to literalize everything. And it was it doesn't make sense. But when I knew and understood how to look at things metaphorically and instead of literally, oh my gosh, it's everything just expanded, all the stories, all of the details. And be sure to subscribe because I'm going to be doing a video about Adam and Eve as metaphor, and that's going to be a fun one to explore. So be sure to subscribe so you can check that out when it comes. So we've talked about where we find metaphor, but how do we use metaphor to feel more empowered? So I believe everything, all of us, all of nature, all of existence is connected on a certain level. Inexplicably, I don't profess to have all the answers. But because of that sense of connection, we have this capacity to relate to everything in life. And so when we work with that idea, metaphor comes alive, right? We can find out more about ourselves through my own inner tree, let's say, right? And I encourage you, take a look at the details of my Solace journey in the description because I actually relate to the archetype of the tree and the stages of the journey and how we start with the roots and then there's the trunk and then there's the branching out and the blossoming and fruiting, right? These are stages of our own development that we can relate to through looking at a tree and looking at how it metaphorically lives within us. So this is how we use metaphor in our day-to-day lives. We can see metaphor in stories, right? We can read a story and look at how that relates to our life without it literally representing our life, but just knowing that, yes, I had a similar trauma and trial and difficulty and challenge and success and victory, or whatever it is, right? We start to see this in the picture of things. And we are able then to offer a different kind of compassion toward life, a different kind of understanding, because we start to see more of life within us and ourselves within more of life. So I'd like to leave you with a bit of a challenge, okay? I'd like to ask you to consider how today or tomorrow you can start to look at where things in your life are a metaphor for you. How are you that cup of coffee that you drink in the morning? From how it's made to how it ends up in your cup to how you drink it. How is that living in you, right? Do you feel like you're getting ground up like a coffee bean sometimes? Do you feel like, life is draining you, emptying the cup? Like, think about it. It could be different for everyone. It doesn't matter. There's not one version. We can all relate to a metaphor in a different way depending on our own experience. So ask yourself, how are you that cup of coffee? How are you that story that you read from the beginning to the end and all of the adventures and characters within it? How does an animal like a bear live in you, from the way they behave to the activities and to maybe the structure and ways that they're seen, right? How is that living in you, right? We hear even the concept of a term for mothers, mama bear, right? We know what that means. We have a sense of that. How are you the sky, from the clear blue sky to the cloudy gray raining sky? Think about that. Think about how these are in you. I challenge you to do it, because you might start to be surprised at how much you can begin to know yourself when we see ourselves in metaphor. So enjoy the fun, enjoy the challenge. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. Subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.